Hi, everyone. It's Rob Gray from the Perception Action Podcast, back with another article review. So, in this one, I want to talk about how effort changes movement coordination. So, effort we can consider and conceptualize as a constraint, right? As you increase the effort, the amount of output you want to create, obviously that's going to create a constraint on how you organize your movement and organize your degrees of freedom. So, I want to look at a new study that has kind of investigated this in a really interesting way in baseball pitching. But before that, I want to kind of emphasize something that I, talk a lot about on the podcast is that in movement coordination, when we're solving the degrees of freedom problem, we should expect to see both invariance and variance. What I mean by that is when we look at different performers performing the same skill, like throwing a baseball or, Bernstein's case, hammering, we should expect them to have some similar aspects to their movements, right? There's some features of throwing, right? If you want to throw hard, there's some features that have to be there that are invariant across performers and are relatively invariant across execution. So there's going to be some level of consistency, right? And, we see that in a lot of different ways. In, baseball pitching, we can see that if we look at kind of the standard deviation of different kinematic measures like elbow angles, elbow velocities, they get lower at higher levels when you're talking about major league pitchers. If we look at how different kinematic features relate to the consistency of locating a pitch, we see a relationship there, right? The more consistent certain kinematic features are, the more consistently you locate pitches, right? So invariance, having some level of consistency, is incredibly important, right? There's no denying that. What we're trying to emphasize kind of with this ecological approach and different views on learning is the problem that people have ignoring, though, is that it equally important is the variance, right? What differs between executions, what differs between performers, right? And I've talked about this before. For example, the study by Fleissig et al., where they looked at the relationship between the consistency of kinematic measures and the consistency of locating a pitch when you're throwing. Yes, they found a relationship there, but it only explained about 58% of the variance. So there's a lot of things good differing between each execution to get the ball to the same location. So the key point there, movement has both invariant and variant properties. It always will, right? It always will. So the question we can kind of lead into today's article from that is, how does the organization of degrees of freedom change with effort, right? So if I ask you to throw a ball at 50% of your effort versus 100% of your effort, what changes, right? In particular, we could ask, relating to what I've been talking about, do things become more invariant, right? Do performers start to use more and more of the same strategy? Or is there still a role for the variance, right? On the one hand, we might expect as we get higher and higher to our maximum, things are going to get more and more invariant, right? Because there's less ways you can achieve the goal, right? The constraints are much, much more severe. If you think about it, say you can throw a ball 80 miles an hour, right? If I ask you to throw 40 miles an hour, literally, you could do that several different ways. You could throw it underhand, probably. You could throw it sidearm, overhand. But as you go to your max, right, to achieve your maximum possible pitch velocity, there's going to be much less range of solutions. So we might expect things to get more and more similar across performers when we push them to their max, right? So that's kind of what we want to look at today. And the study I want to look at is by Hashimoto and colleagues, very recent study published in Nature, looking at effort-dependent effects on baseball pitching. So what they did in this study, and they really, in the introduction to the study, they do a really nice job kind of discussing the invariance and variance, just like I did. These quotes I really like. In contrast to the common motion features, each pitcher throws a fastball with a diverse form setup with differences evident in their stride, arm cocking, release, and follow through. Pitching motion thus consists of common and unique motion features, right? So what they mean by that, yes, we can divide a pitching motion into distinct phases that almost all pitchers use, right? A stride, cocking, release, follow through. But there's a lot of variance within that, from pitcher to pitcher and execution to execution. Then the second point here they make is that where these come from is redundancy in our motor system, right? From having redundant degrees of freedom, right? There's lots of different ways we can achieve the same result, right? Which is, degrees of freedom in redundancy. So that's why we get the variance, okay? Invariance, because some of our individual constraints, our intrinsic dynamics are going to be similar from person to person. So there's going to be some invariance, but we also have this redundancy. So those two things combine to give these effects. So what they wanted to do in this study was to look at how the invariant and variant properties, so that what they call common and diverse motion features, change in pitching as we asked you to increase your effort. And what they did was they used EMG. They had pitchers throw at 50, 80, and 100% of their effort. And they used 8 pitchers from university leagues or Japanese baseball leagues. So they were kind of, skilled, experienced pitchers, but not at a super high level, you might say. They threw at these different intensities, 50, 80, or 100% for 10 trials each, right? They're throwing fastballs to a catcher. There was no hitter. They measured their actual pitch velocities to show that they did increase velocity in these different conditions. They use kind of the standard phases of pitching that have been identified in lots of other studies, where you break the pitching motion into the windup, the stride, accelerate, follow through, etc., which you can relate to timing, and we'll see how that comes in a little bit, right? So they're having pitchers throw at these different effort levels and measuring EMG. To investigate this, to look at the effects of effort, they used a really interesting analysis called a tensor decomposition. And I'll admit the analyses used in this paper are quite complex, right? They're quite complex, and I'm going to try to give you my simplified, maybe wrong understanding of some of these things, okay? But what they did was to take the EMG activity when you're throwing at these different intensity effort levels, and for each pitcher, they broke it down into 3 components, right? They broke it down into spatial component. So what muscles were most active, right? They broke it down into temporal component. When did the highest EMG activity occur in those phases, right? Did it occur in the stride phase, the follow through, etc.? And then they looked at how these things varied as a function of effort, right? So this tensor, they call it, has these 3 parts to it. And as an example, if you're watching the video, you can see this. If not, I'll describe it, right? So we can talk about this, what they call the spatial module, which looks at the relative EMG activity in different muscles, right? So you can look at the arm muscles, the deltoid, the abdominals, the lower body. So this, what I'm talking about is one particular tensor. So a tensor has relative muscle activities. You can look at the time the maximum EMG occurs relative to the release of the ball. This example I'm showing here, the time is the maximum EMG is occurring about 350 to 400 milliseconds before release. Then you can look at how these different EMG changes with effort, right? Does it increase as you go from 50 to 100, etc.? Right? So that's how they're going to do it. They're going to break the motion down into these tensors, these groups of spatial temporal features that are affected by effort. And as an example, this one that I'm talking about right now, one of the first tensors they found was you get this kind of EMG activity that occurs about 300 milliseconds before release, which is about in the middle of the stride phase. The muscles recruited seem to be the larger muscles in the upper body, the trapezius and the deltoid, which are involved in moving your arm backwards, kind of getting the cocking of it. But in this example, they showed there's no relationship to effort, right? The activity of the EMG is the same whether you're throwing 50, 80, 100%. Right? So that's an example of a tensor. It has these 3 components in it: this relative muscle activity, the time when it occurred, and the effort. So what they did was, for each pitcher, they identified these tensors in kind of a cluster analysis almost way, right? So they could break the movement down into these tensors, right? And in the paper, you can see there's a figure where they show 8 different tensors, right? So each tensor has muscle activity, time it occurred, and effective effort. And what they did was they found a handful of these tensors that were related to effort, right? So the amount of EMG would increase from 50 to 80% and 80 to 100, for example, right? So they identified these tensors. They found some components of the EMG, some aspects of the coordination change with effort, and some don't, right? And you can look at the paper for the exact effects here, the exact tensors. Okay, so for each picture they found this, right? They found these effects. Next, what they did was to try to do an overall analysis across all the pictures, right? So taking these tensors, can we describe the effects of increasing effort based on, they almost did kind of a cluster analysis, right? So a principal components analysis. So we're going to take what aspects of the EMG can describe the increases in changes that occur with increase in effort. And what they found was basically the principal components analysis revealed two components that could explain the data, right? The first one, the principal component one, explained what happened when you asked a person to increase from 50 to either 80 or 100, right? There was no difference in 80 or 100 between these ones, okay? The second one, principal component two, was it could explain the data from 80 to 100. So when I asked you to push you the very last limit to get to your maximum. So let's look at these a little bit more. The first principal component, as I said, was explain the data as you change from 50 to higher. What they found was that this involved including muscles in your arm, right? Including your bicep, including and your deltoid and your dominant arm that you're throwing with, okay? This seemed to mostly occur about 300 milliseconds before the release, which is kind of the transition from stride to cocking, and also right at the release point, right? So basically what's going on here is you're pulling in, you're using more activity in your arm and your shoulder, your upper body, your hand to create more full shoulder, more rotation, more extension, right? To throw harder, right? The key point that they found with this first principal component, so as you went from 50 to either 80 or 100, the pattern was very, very similar across the 8 participants. So the way that they increased effort across the participants was very, very similar, right? So they all tended to do it in the same way by increasing the arm activity in this way. And if you're watching the video here, you could see that in the figure, right? You can see each of those circles is a point for a different individual. You can see they cluster pretty well together for the different efforts. But interestingly, as they looked at the data as you go from 80 to 100, so throwing at 80% of your maximum to 100%, which was principal component 2, what they found was there's no consistent recruitment across the subjects, right? Each subject could do this, right? They threw the ball harder, but they did it in completely different ways, right? There was no similar way either in terms of the spatial, which muscles were used to throw harder, or the timing, right? Some were done at about 400 milliseconds, other were done in the middle of stride phase, right? So what the quote from the paper, we regarded the principal component 2 spatial temporal module as diverse EMG features rather than common EMG features, right? So what they're saying here is these are variant properties. The way that people increase from 80 to 100 is different from individual to individual, right? And the data shows that. Again, if you could see this or you look in the paper, you can see the white dots are not even close to lying on top of each other. They're all over the place, right? People are doing different things as they increase their effort. Right. So overall, they seem to show this really interesting finding that, again, increasing effort involves both variant and invariant components. Right. If you want to go from 50% effort to up, right, people seem to do that in a very common way. Right. They use similar changes in the muscle recruitment, similar recruitment of degrees of freedom. But that last little bit, getting from 80% to your absolute maximum, is very individual, right? And it depends on the intrinsic dynamics and your individual characteristics, your individual constraints, probably. They didn't really relate it directly to that, but of course it's going to depend on that. So again, the story is the same, right? What I started with is, again, important to emphasize. There's movement, the solving the degrees of freedom problem is going to be similar in some ways because we all share similar intrinsic dynamics, but it's also going to be variant, right? And that variance, understanding how an individual pitcher maybe gets from 80 to 100, may be critical for understanding why some pitchers get injured a lot and others don't, right? Maybe the certain way that pitchers get to 100 is safer and less chance of injury than others, right? Or maybe it's less fatiguing and so on. So understanding that variance and how we can help optimize it for an individual, I think, is incredibly important, right? So I think this is a really interesting study. Again, I think looking at this constraint of effort and how it relates to solving the degrees of freedom problem is a really, really interesting question. So that's it for this review. Thanks for joining me, and cheers for now.